Hey everybody. In this lecture, we're going to continue our discussion of the Victorian era and the Victorians. In the last lecture, I was talking about dramatic changes that were happening in the 19th century, and I told you it was going to be important to understand the scope of these changes because in a lot of ways, Victorianism was a kind of coping mechanism, a strategy for dealing with these dramatic changes by the middle class. And now we're going to get to talking about this coping mechanism. So think of Victorianism as a kind of guide for behavior at a time in which things seemed like they were changing faster than they had ever changed for the middle class. And what I have here for you are the elements of Victorianism. That these are beliefs and values that when you ball them together, you get Victorianism. And as I told you before, what Larry May is really interested in his book is the transition from a Victorian America to a modern America. If we're going to understand this transition, we need to understand not only who the Victorians were, but what Victorianism was. So let's get into this list. The first one on this list is Protestant religious belief. The Protestants were Christians that broke away from the Catholic Church. Prior to the 1500s, Christianity in Europe was largely unified under the Catholic Church. But in the early 1500s, some Christians started to break away from the Catholic Church. The root word in Protestant is protest. These were the Christians that protested against the Catholic Church. Now, many of the early settlers to what is now the United States came from Protestant backgrounds. So Protestant Christianity became the sort of preferred, privileged version of Christianity in the United States. So for the respectable middle class of the Victorian era, Protestant Christianity was the expectation. If you weren't Protestant, you were looked down upon. If you were Catholic, you were looked down upon. If you were Jewish, you were very much looked down upon. Okay, and so during times of change, and as we have established during this Victorian era, there was tremendous change. One thing that some in the middle class did was hold on to their religious faith. As things seemed like they were changing in unprecedented ways, one thing that's not supposed to change is God. Okay, so one of the things we associate with Victorianism is Protestant Christian faith. Does that mean every Victorian was a devout Christian? No, of course not. There were varying degrees of commitment and faith for the Victorians. But at the very least, you were expected to keep up the image of Christian faith. You were supposed to at least play along with this. So one of the things we associate with Victorianism, Protestant religious faith. Second on our list, growing belief in progress. Through most of human history, there hasn't been much sense of the idea of progress. People were born and people died. Old kings were deposed and new kings were ascended. Wars were fought, one side won, one side lost. There's been change, obviously, throughout history, but not much sense of progress. But as we start getting into the 1800s in particular, there was a growing sense that things don't simply change, but things get better. That life is progressive. Okay. Now think of it this way. One way to cope with dramatic change is to see change in a progressive fashion. So think of so many of those things that I talked about in the last lecture industrialism, capitalism, social mobility, urbanization. Increasingly, the Victorians told themselves that this just wasn't change, but rather this is progress. This is getting better. Things are getting better. So one of the things we associate with the Victorians is a kind of optimism about change, that change moves in a progressive way, that things get better. Through most of human history, people didn't have much sense of this. My life was, I thought, much the same as my grandfather's life. And if I looked at imagined my grandchildren's lives, I imagine they're going to be much the same as my life. But as we get particularly to the 1800s, there's a growing sense of, no, my life is dramatically different than my grandfather's life. And I suspect my grandchildren's lives will be even more different. And not just different, but better. My life's better than my grandfather's, and I bet my grandkids' lives will be even better than ours. So one of the things we associate with the Victorians and Victorian belief was a kind of faith in progress, a kind of optimistic view that the future is going to get better. Okay. Number 3 on our list, an emphasis on self-reliance and individualism. Think of this emphasis on self-reliance and individualism, once again, as a kind of coping mechanism for the increasingly competitive world of industrialism and capitalism. Okay. In the last lecture, I talked about a hypothetical New England village prior to the rise of capitalism and industrialism, in which members of that community tended to be more communal, not think of their lives in terms of competition and individualism, but rather working together and sharing. In that context, think about a farmer who wasn't a particularly good farmer, not particularly hardworking. In that context, neighbors might have helped out a bit, pulled a little bit more weight, helped get this individual through. But as we get to the Victorian age, and increasingly the more competitive world of capitalism, cutthroat world of capitalism and industrialism, that community is not going to be looking out for you as much. We talked about urbanization. Increasingly, people are living in worlds of strangers surrounded in a city. There's just not as many people that are going to help you out for this. So one of the things the Victorians started to really try to instill into their children, especially their sons, was going to be the need for self-reliance, for discipline, for taking care of yourself. Because in certain ways, the world was becoming more demanding and more competitive. So one of the things we associate with the Victorianism is this increasing individualism, more concern for self, and more expectation for self-reliance. Okay. Increasing social standards we see. Again, that little farming, that hypothetical farming village of a pre-Victorian age, they had ideas of manners and etiquette in that community. Absolutely they did. But in that little village, everybody knew each other. Right? And because of that, there could have been a degree of informality. You knew everybody, everybody knew you. But with the social mobility of the Victorian age, and especially the urbanization. Remember our example of New York City, that in the beginning of the 19th century goes from a population of 60,000 people to, by the end of that century, a population of 3.8 million. One way to think of urbanization is that people increasingly found themselves living in worlds of strangers, where you're surrounded by people that you don't know. in your community, in your streets, in places of business. Most people you see, you do not know. For all intents and purposes, they are strangers to you. In this world, social standards, manners, etiquette, expectations of dress, of grooming, of etiquette, of manners become more important because you are surrounded more by strangers. You need ways to evaluate and judge these strangers. And so social standards became that. Again, that hypothetical pre-Victorian New England village, did they have expectations for manners and etiquette? Sure they did, but they weren't as acute because you knew everybody and everybody knew you. It was rare you encountered strangers. And so therefore, manners and etiquette weren't quite so necessary to size people up. But as we get into the Victorian, particularly the late Victorian era, especially in urban areas, we see much more emphasis on manners and etiquette, social standards in general. The Victorians are famous for being kind of stuffy and uptight when it comes to these issues because they were trying to figure out, how do we live in a world of strangers? And so they really went overboard in terms of creating expectations, how you dress, how you speak, manners in interacting with people. All right. Now, the next one, fifth, sexual and emotional restraint. This one I need to qualify a little bit. Okay. The Victorians are famous for being prudes, very sexually uptight about issues. But where I need to be careful is we need to make sure we differentiate between what people say they do and what people actually do. Okay. If the only thing you knew about the Victorians came from their newspapers, from their magazines, from their books, from sermons that were delivered by ministers in churches, yes, it would appear that the Victorians were very sexually restrained. Okay. Where does this reputation come from? Well, during the Victorian era, it became a common expectation that not only were individuals expected to refrain from premarital sex, to not engage in premarital sex, but even once you were married, within the bonds of marriage, you were expected to limit sexual activity to attempts at procreation. In other words, even for a married couple, if you weren't actively trying to have a child, you should limit sexual activity. Why? Well, the Victorians developed some strange ideas about what too much sex would do to you. For men, engaging in too much sex was supposed to sort of sap some sort of vital masculine energy. It was supposed to drain your resources. The last vestiges of this we see in fight culture, where even to this day, some people, boxers, mixed martial artists, when they go into training for a fight, will cut off sex, believing that this will help them prepare for winning their next bout. Okay. Where does that idea come from in fight culture? That comes from these older Victorian notions that too much sexual activity will weaken men. If you've ever watched the old movie Rocky, Rocky's trainer Mickey is kind of upset when Rocky gets a girlfriend, and Rocky or Mickey the trainer tells Rocky, women weaken knees. Right? That's old Victorian idea of what sex does to men. For women, too much sex was even worse. For women, they would develop hysteria. There were ideas of physical damage it would do to the body, to the uterus. None of this true either for men or for women, but these were the fears. Okay. Now I said before, we need to separate what people say they do and what they really do. Like I told you, if all we knew about the Victorians came from newspapers and magazines and minister sermons and books, then yes, it would seem that the Victorians refrained from sex all but when they were trying to have children. But of course, people live lives that don't always conform to societal expectations. Okay, so it turns out that most middle-class Americans during the Victorian age actually ignored this teaching about only having sex when you're trying to procreate. When they went into their bedrooms and the lights turned off, people were doing things that they weren't supposed to necessarily be doing. So there's a difference between what people are expected to do and what they actually do. There's been more recent scholarship that's looked not at magazines and newspapers and sermons, but for example, the letters of correspondence between couples when they were separated from one another, when they thought they were talking in private. And it becomes clear from this correspondence that these people were much more sexual, much more much freakier than we would have imagined from, reading newspapers about what the Victorians were supposed to be doing. So we need to make sure that we qualify this perception of the Victorians as being prudes. Yes, based on newspapers, they seemed like prudes, but actually in their actual lived life, they were actually often ignoring a lot of this advice. The best analogy I can create to get you to kind of understand this is with American Catholics. Okay, strictly speaking, birth control is prohibited by the teachings of the Catholic Church. According to the Catholic Church, Catholics are not supposed to be using any form of birth control. Okay, however, about 97% of American Catholics actually ignore the Church's teaching on this issue. Okay, it's why you have Catholic families with only 2 children and not Catholic families with 10 children. Don't get me wrong, some American Catholics follow the Church's teaching in this, and they tend to have very large families. But most Catholics ignore what they're told in this regard of Catholic teaching. Okay, we can kind of think of this similar to the Victorians in terms of what their society was telling them to do and then what they were actually doing in their bedrooms. Now, this will be important because Victorians are going to have a negative reaction to certain aspects of movies because of the sexual content of movies projected on screens in public. Okay, so they might have done different things in their bedroom, but in terms of public perceptions of sexuality, they could be quite negative. All right? So one of the things we associate with the Victorians is a kind of sexual prudery. Right? They were supposed to be really uptight. Were they actually that uptight in their own lives? No, not really. But that was the perception. Okay. Finally, another element we associate with Victorianism is the centrality of the home and the woman's special place within the home. As we talked about before, the Victorians were middle class, and one of the hallmarks of Victorian middle class status was that women did not work. Contrary to popular perception that women never used to work, yes, women did used to work. Poor women used to work. Working class women often used to work. They worked because they had to. They were poor. They were working class. It was the luxury of the middle class, that the middle class man could afford enough that the woman did not work. And in the Victorian world, there was almost this separation between the world of the home, which was the realm of women, and the public realm, the realm of work. That was the realm of men. The Victorians had special ideas about the role of women in society. And we'll talk about that more as we talk about representations of women in movies as we go on. So when we put these elements together, we get Victorianism. People with varying degrees of faith in Protestant religion, but even if you didn't believe that strongly, you had to at least play along with this. A growing faith in progress, a growing emphasis on self-reliance and individualism, growing expectations about social standards like manners and etiquette and grooming, expectations of sexual and emotional restraint, keeping that in check, and a view of women holding a special place separate from men, and the home being a special sanctuary for those women that they control, that they sort of dominate. Okay, all those all together, that is Victorianism. Okay, we're going to see as we get into the 20th century that these Victorian beliefs come under increasing challenge as a modern 20th century America starts to develop. And we will see in the rise and evolution of movies how movies play a part, sometimes challenging these Victorian ideas and notions, and other times trying to reinforce and maintain these Victorian ideas and beliefs. That's what Larry May is really interested in the book. He's not just writing some generic book on the history of the rise and evolution of movies. He's giving a history of the rise and evolution of movies that is really sensitive to the way in which movies marked a transition from this older Victorian world to a modern world, and increasingly in which Victorian notions are being challenged. It's a really interesting book. I like it a lot. Okay. All right. The last thing we'll do this lecture is talk about Victorian attitudes towards leisure. There we go. Movies are going to be a form of entertainment. They're going to be a form of leisure. So before we even get to movies specifically, let's talk about what were Victorian attitudes about leisure, about having fun. Okay. The first thing you need to know, the first thing May helps us understand, is you have to appreciate the Victorian suspicion or skepticism about leisure. There's an old adage, idle hands are the tools of the devil. What does that mean? Idle hands are the tools of the devil. Well, that means when you're not engaged in something productive like work or school or study, when you're bored, when you have nothing to do, you're probably going to be more tempted to get into trouble. Okay? Nobody ever gets in trouble while they're doing their math homework. They get in trouble on Friday nights at 2 a.m. That's when you get into trouble. Okay? And so the first place to start with Victorian attitudes about leisure is to start with their kind of fear of it, their concern about leisure. Right? They worried about it. And so often the Victorians tried to structure leisure or entertainment in ways that seemed to be sort of productive, work-like, study-like. What's a good Victorian form of entertainment? Learning to play an instrument, learning to play piano. It requires work, it requires a discipline. It has a byproduct, which is beautiful music, particularly before recorded music. Right around the same time we get movies, we get phonographs and recorded music. But, you know, it wasn't that long ago that if you wanted to hear music, somebody needed to play an instrument or sing live in front of you to make that happen. And so for the Victorians, an ideal form of entertainment, particularly for women, would be piano. It's work. Like nobody ever got in trouble playing the piano unless you were playing late at night and people wanted you to be quiet. Reading a book. It's another form of leisure or entertainment, right? It's work-like there. And so as much as they could, the Victorians preferred forms of leisure that seemed to have characteristics of work, effort, study, that provided some sort of tangible byproduct. Men could go out hunting, right? Good thing about hunting is if you had a successful day hunting, you're going to bring some meat home. Okay? There's some sort of byproduct there. All right. Not only did the Victorians have some fear of leisure and entertainment, that, by the way, they understood you needed to relax, you needed leisure, you needed entertainment. So it's not like they were saying, you have to stay at work 24 hours a day. They understood there was the need for leisure, but insofar as they did, they preferred to make that leisure replicate work or study. Yeah. But leisure activity was also often divided by class. The Victorians were middle class, and they tended not to like activity that would put them in close proximity to the poor, the working class. They liked their leisure activity separate, divided from the unwashed masses below them. So think of going to the theater, which was a popular form of entertainment. Not movies yet, live theater. Well, the middle class could be relatively secure when they went to the theater, knowing that either the poor couldn't afford the ticket to get in there, or if they were, they would be sitting in a completely different section, up in the balcony, in the orchestra pit, away from the middle class, who, when they were sitting, would be likely sitting amongst their own, because the poor and the working class just couldn't afford their seats. Okay. The Victorians also liked their leisure divided by gender. Men and women tended to have different kind of activities that they did. Right? There wasn't a lot of overlap between male and female leisure activity. Sewing was a good leisure activity for women. Women could participate in sewing circles. So during a Saturday church picnic, some of the women would bring their sewing, and they would sit, sometimes literally in a circle, and do their sewing together and talk and discuss. So rather than doing their sewing in isolation, which could be kind of boring, they would do it with other people surrounded by them, other women. Okay, men maybe go out hunting, like I talked about before. There wasn't a lot of overlap between what men did and what women did. Keep them separate from each other. Okay. Now, all of these things I've just described, the skepticism of leisure, but when partaking in leisure, it should have some element of, kind of study or work, or have some kind of byproduct at the end of it. Sewn clothing, beautiful music, meat from a hunt. Activity that is divided by class. Different seating in different venues between the middle class and the poor. Leisure activity that is divided by gender, where men do their thing and women do their other thing. Silent movies and silent movie going is going to violate all of this. The Victorians are not going to like the movies one bit. Think of what going to the movies was. And until relatively recently, has almost always been. Right? Sit in a darkened movie theater, watch images projected larger than life on the screen. That requires no work. That requires no discipline. You kind of sit there and veg out, watch what's on the screen. After the movie's over, nothing productive has been created. There's no sewn clothing. There's no meat to bring home after the movies. Nothing productive has been created. No discipline, no work went into that. You just sat and you vegged out and you watched a movie. Now, you enjoyed it. It was entertaining, but there's no discipline involved in it. Movies were general admission. Up until relatively recently, still are mostly general admission, but they were. So that meant, if you were middle class and bought a ticket to go to the movies, you didn't know who you were going to be sitting next to. You didn't know whose elbows you were going to be rubbing up against. The poor, the working class, and in fact, as we'll talk about in the next lecture, many of the first people that enjoyed movies the most did come from the lower classes. So you were almost guaranteed early on, if you were middle class going to the movies, you were going to be rubbing elbows with some poor people, some working class people. They weren't going to like that. Also, movies weren't divided by gender. Men liked them, women liked them, and my God, think of the context. Men and women, strange men and women, sitting next to each other in a darkened space. Who knows what's going to go on in there? As we'll talk about beginning in the next lecture, there's going to be just nothing about the movie-going experience that the Victorians are going to like, that the middle class is going to like. Until eventually they start going. And it turns out that movies were fun. But May has this discussion of Victorian